Welcome back to MindXMotive. Sorry for the long hiatus and the immense wait for the second episode on the Charles Sobhraj case. But trust me, diving into the mind of Charles is not a journey you want to rush. Now let's rewind, shall we? Where had we left off? Ah yes, a MindXMotive episode with absolutely no mention of a motive. I can be frustrating sometimes, but this is not my fault. All that we can see him tangibly get out of these murders were forged passports and traveler's checks, which frankly were not worth much, as he was killing people on the hippie trail who decided life was too boring and just left theirs behind. Henricus and Cornelia were a couple who were down on their luck and just wanted a year of peace. Turns out, their peaceful trip was a death sentence. It is safe to assume that they did not have much worth stealing. Let's not forget that Charles's alias was a well-established gem dealer, assuring him enough money. Perhaps he was a megalomaniac, just wanted to do everything he could to display his power and thought this to be an easy way to gain followership and fame. Well, rather, infamy. But that's usually how it goes if this is the field you use as your means to the spotlight. I suppose it does finally boil down to this reason, but it's not as clear-cut as you would assume it to be. While Sobhraj is believed to be a psychopath due to his manipulative personality and his incapability to show remorse, his motives for killing differed from those of most serial killers. Sobhraj was not driven to murder by deep-seated violent impulses, but rather for personal gain, as a means to sustain his lifestyle of adventure, all for the thrill of it. Although he's not the first with such an insipid and irrational motive, he certainly did take it too far. He was a thrill seeker who was willing to do just about anything for the plot. We can certainly see this in his final arrest in Nepal, which was entirely avoidable and instigated by him. It was the singular place where the statute of limitations had not run out on his crimes, and he chose to return. Charles liked the challenge. The fear of being caught was almost intoxicating to him, and he was drunk on the wine of that exhilaration. Before I start sharing my viewpoint on this man and his madness, let's discuss what some people who directly interviewed him had to say about him. Alan Dawson was a Bangkok-based journalist for the United Press International, UPI, who interviewed Charles Sobhraj in the Tihar jail in 1984. A direct quote from Dawson is, quote, "Well, he never had a good answer. He implied that if I was going to write a book on him, then the answer would be that all these white people had corrupted and ruined Asia by trafficking opium, and therefore his reasoning was that today's white people deserve to die for it." End quote. This was never a convincing enough answer for Dawson, and even after interviewing Charles Sobhraj, he was left unsatisfied. Seeing his murder was definitely worse than trafficking drugs, his argument is really lackadaisical on the moral front. The book, On the Trail of the Serpent, by Richard Neville and his wife Julie Clark, is a work of journalism. I highly recommend it. Although it goes into some gory details, the book was a great source of information for this case. Neville admitted that he went into the interview with a preconceived theory that Sobhraj was a product of colonialism, acting out some form of revenge against Western counterculture. Instead, he found himself confronted by what he described as a brilliant psychopath. According to Neville, whenever he asked Sobhraj why he committed his crimes, Sobhraj insisted that he never killed good people, like it was up to him to decide. He would pull from psychoanalysis, global politics, and even Buddhism to construct a comfortable narrative that justified his actions and softened their reality. Sobhraj framed his life as a, quote, "protest against the French legal system," unquote, and claimed that his love for Vietnam and Asia drove his criminal career. Explanations Neville dismissed as absurd. However, as Neville noted, these stories were highly effective tools for psychological manipulation. When Neville asked Sobhraj what he believed creates a murderer, Sobhraj replied that, quote, either they have too much feeling and cannot control themselves, or they have no feelings at all, unquote. Notably, he never clarified which of these two he believed applied to him. For a man that is so very overconfident and tends to go back on his word a lot, he was once interviewed and confessed to having upwards of 100 victims, but here he challenges even 5.
I'm fed up of all the allegations, and so I decide that I'm going to put forward my facts and let the people decide.
So our experts will be looking at accusations that you drugged, murdered and disposed of 5 victims in Thailand in 1975.
There's a lot of imagination, yeah. Please, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Am I permitted to ask you a question? From where are you taking this number? You are exactly as many the victim of brainwashing by the media. I welcome to be confronted with those experts. Only I request that confront me with the best of in each field, the best one.
Big words for a man who at any interview would alter his story and never answered questions in a linear manner. Maybe this was his need for controversy and wanting to remain in the limelight, which made him lie. Now, with that segment aside, let's go into his usual behavioral patterns and demeanor. Let's take a moment to actually unpack the man behind the myth, the rotten core beneath the cool guy persona. So, who are we dealing with here? How do you fathom someone who can smile while stealing someone's identity and then leave the person's body burned not so far away? Well, psychologists and crime analysts have tried to break it down, and the consensus is that he is an amalgamation of manipulative genius, emotional vacancy, and a non-existent motive, all wrapped into a horrifying modus operandi. First off, nearly every reputable profile flags Sobhraj's superficial charm as one of the core tools in his psychological toolkit. He wasn't this brutish brute, but instead, he was socially smooth, able to adapt his persona to whomever he was with and use that to gain trust. That's part of the textbook definition of a psychopath: charm along with a jarring lack of empathy. He seemed to only form relationships to exploit them. He understood instinctively how to read them, persuade them, and then discard them once they'd outlived their usefulness. Hint hint, Ajay Chaudhary. And yes, perchance you've seen people describe him as just evil, but more importantly, he lacked emotional depth. Investigators and profiles that lean on clinical frameworks describe a very specific deficit. As for him, emotions were merely tools for manipulation without any moral implications. Narcissism also played a big role throughout his life. Even after arrests and imprisonment, he sought attention, narrative control, and performance. Long after backpacker murder stories faded, he'd court media interviews, demand fees, and tried to alter how his story was told. Now, before any of you can call him a reckless thrill seeker, I just want to say there's a method to his madness. His planning, his ability to escape, to adopt identities, to exploit weaknesses in people and systems. That speaks to a mind that's measured social interactions like a board game, always thinking 2 steps ahead. He was a man who demanded respect, and somehow he always got what he asked for. When Charles was first sent to Tihar jail in New Delhi in 1976, you would expect him to be treated like everyone else. But that's not what happened at all. Instead, what we get to hear from jail officials and eyewitness accounts is a portrait of a man who ruled his prison's existence almost like a sovereign in exile instead of a convicted murderer behind bars. And a serial killer at that. Deputy Superintendent J.P. Naithani said this man lived many lives inside Tihar. Some days he was fighting his legal battles in court, other days he was dealing with journalists and lawyers who came to interview him. And yes, he was infamously charming even in custody. Apparently, Sobhraj had quite a roster of visitors, including women from overseas who came to profess their love for him, some even petitioning the courts for permission to marry him while he was still serving time. But the most extraordinary thing about his daily existence was how comfortable it became. He could roam the halls of the jail freely and even had a TV in his jail cell, along with many other amenities any prisoner would kill for. He got most of his liberties through favors. He would provide all sorts of intel to the police for favors in return for his freedom. Some sources say he was essentially running an empire inside Tihar. That shouldn't be dismissed as mere rumor either. Former IPS officer Amod Kant bluntly said he made friends with everyone, including prisoners with serious criminal reputations, and maintained a kind of informal control over social dynamics inside the prison. Speaking of control and love, which I'm not sure he was capable of displaying, but while serving his life sentence in Kathmandu's central jail, Charles Sobhraj fell in love and in 2008 held a wedding ceremony inside the prison with Nihita Biswas, a young Nepali woman who was the daughter of one of his Nepalese lawyers, Shakuntala Thapa, who had come to work as his interpreter and later appeared on Biggboss Season 5. The ceremony happened on the Dishain festival with blessings and traditional rituals in front of gods and family. The authorities later clarified that this was not a legally registered marriage. However, Nihita and Charles claimed it as a marriage, and it made headlines because of the massive age gap, 20 years, and the fact that she publicly stood by him, insisting his innocence. So when you take a step back and look at Charles Sobhraj in his entirety, not just the crimes, but the persona, the performances, the prisons, the marriage, the interviews, one thing becomes painfully clear. This was not a man who ever felt confined by rules, walls, or even morality. Prison wasn't a punishment to him. It was simply another setting, another backdrop for the same game he'd been playing his entire life. Whether he was slipping through borders on forged passports, charming backpackers into trusting him, or turning a maximum security jail into something disturbingly close to a personal playground, Sobhraj operated on the same principle every single time: control. Control over people, control over narratives, control over how he was perceived. Even when the world finally caught up to him, he still managed to bend the environment around himself just enough to stay comfortable, relevant, and most importantly, interesting. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of this all. Charles Sobhraj wasn't hiding in the shadows. He wasn't a silent predator lurking unnoticed. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be interviewed, written about, psychoanalyzed, adored, and feared. He wanted to be a story, a sensationalized one at that. And judging by the fact that we're still talking about him decades later, well, he got exactly what he wanted. In fact, why don't we hear in his own words how he's doing now after the Nepal imprisonment? Here's a clip of Charles on his flight back to France after finally being set free from Nepal in 2022.
No, I feel great, but now I only look forward now that I have a lot to do. I have to sue a lot of people, including the state of Nepal.
But here's the thing. As tempting as it is to chalk all of this up to psychopathy or narcissism or some neat diagnostic label that lets us box him up and move on, that explanation only gets us so far. Personalities don't form in a vacuum. People don't just wake up one day fully formed villains with a passport full of aliases and a moral compass set permanently to, well, absent. So one thing we really haven't thought about yet is, where does this all come from? Because Charles Sobhraj wasn't just shaped by thrill-seeking or greed. His story starts long before the hippie trail, long before Tihar jail, and long before the headlines. It started with a fractured family, a childhood marked by rejection and instability, a sense of not belonging anywhere, culturally, socially, or emotionally. A man constantly caught between identities, nations, and loyalties, learning very early on that survival meant adaptation, manipulation, and performance. In the next episode, we're going to peel back those layers. We're going to talk about his parents, his upbringing, the colonial and post colonial world he was born into, and the environments that quietly taught him how to lie convincingly. We look at the sociological factors that don't excuse his actions but do help explain how someone like him comes to exist in the first place. But fair warning, his family life makes the rest of the story almost sound justifiable. So, if you're ready to step even further back, away from the crimes and into the conditions that made them possible, I'll see you in the next episode of MindXMotive. This is MindXMotive. I'm your host, Raya. Thank you for tuning in, and see you soon on the next episode. Just remember, at the end of the day, when the act is over, the mind remains.